Started. So, good morning, everyone. Today we are going to see case discussions. So, as today is first time, I want to give some introduction to the case discussion before going to the cases. So, first of all, why a patient comes to us? So, when he gets a disease, so a patient don't know that he is having some disease. So, when a disease occurs in a patient, due to any cause, the disease can be due to some genetic cause, hereditary, or it can be due to some infection, microorganisms, or it can be due to some injury or any other foreign bodies, anything, any cause. When a disease comes to a patient, then there will be some damage to the anatomical organs or a tissue, or there will be defect in the biochemical mechanisms or biochemical metabolisms. Then the physiological functions of the patient will be affected. Then he will be getting the signs and symptoms. Due to that signs and symptoms, the patient comes to the doctor, clinician. Okay. So in any disease, the patient does not know that he is having a disease. He will come due to the symptoms and signs which occur due to that disease. So these symptoms and signs are known as clinical features. Okay, clinical features. So clinical features include signs and symptoms due to which the patient comes to us. When after the patient coming to us, then first we will be doing the general examination. So general examination means we will see what is the build of the patient, what is the appearance, what is his build, what is his normal appearance. All these things we will see in the general examination. And we will see the vitals of the patient. We will see in the general examination, and we will see whether the patient is anemic or not, he is having jaundice or not. All these things we will see in the general examination. So after general examination, any doctor or any clinician, after general examination, they will be looking for the systemic examination. Systemic examination means the examination of the individual systems, the respiratory system, cardiovascular system, or central nervous system, or gastrointestinal system. So any systemic examination, in particularly if the clinician examines, then that is known as systemic examination. Then why this clinical examination, systemic examination are needed? So all these are needed for the diagnosis, approach to the diagnosis. So for treating a patient, we have to know which disease the patient is suffering from. So for the diagnosis, we have to see the clinical features, general examination, systemic examination. So by seeing all the signs, symptoms, and general examination, all the vitals, whether he is having anemia or not, jaundice or not, and after doing a systemic examination, individual systems, we will come to a provisional diagnosis. So provisional diagnosis means maybe the patient is suffering from a particular disease, or maybe a particular system is affected in this patient. So that is known as provisional diagnosis. So after coming to the provisional diagnosis, we will send the patient to the investigations. Whether it can be blood investigations or radiological investigations. After getting to the provisional diagnosis, we will send the patient to the investigations. So after investigations, after getting the results of the investigations, we will get to the final diagnosis of the patient. So when the patient comes with the signs and symptoms, we will start the diagnosis. We will start the approach to the diagnosis right from the signs and symptoms. So after signs and symptoms, we can come to a conclusion that the patient may be suffering from a particular system. He may be suffering from a particular disease. So after that, we'll see the general examination. In general examination, we'll get more confirmation which disease he might be affected. And after that, we will go to the systemic examination, in which we will individually examine each system and we will more focus on the system which we suspect that that system is affected. The system that is affected, that we suspect, we will focus more on that system, and we will do all other systems also in the systemic examination. We will examine all other systems also in the systemic examination. By all these, we will come to a provisional diagnosis that maybe he might be affected by a particular disease. We will come to the provisional diagnosis. After coming to the provisional diagnosis, we will send the patient to the investigations which are relevant to that diagnosis. And after getting the results of the diagnosis, we will come to the final diagnosis. So after getting to the final diagnosis, we will give the treatment to the patient. So by the results of the final diagnosis, we will be knowing whether the disease is present or not in the patient. And we will be knowing the severity and the extent of the disease. And we will be knowing whether the complications of the disease are started or not. So by considering all these factors, we will give the treatment to the patient. So coming to the individual parts, the clinical features include signs and symptoms. So the symptoms are subjective evidence of a disease which can be perceived by a patient. So patient can feel the change in the body, change in the physiological functions. So that is known as symptoms. The normal well-being is disturbed and that is perceived by the patient. That is known as symptoms. Okay. And these symptoms, the patient mostly come with the symptoms only. He will present the symptoms before us. So the examples for the symptoms are fever, cough, and anxiety. All these are examples for the symptoms. Next, coming to the signs, which are a part of clinical features. It is objective evidence of a disease which can be elicited by a doctor or clinician. So the signs we will be eliciting in the patient when he comes to us with the symptoms. So the examples of the symptoms are tenderness, hepatomegaly, Tinel sign. All these are examples for the sign. Tenderness means when we touch or when we give a little pressure, the patient will get pain. That is known as tenderness. And hepatomegaly means the enlargement of liver that can be assessed by palpating the abdomen. Then we can palpate the outer borders of the liver and we can suspect some hepatomegaly. And apart from that, there are different signs, the Tinel sign, Phelan sign, different signs are there. All these signs are elicited by the clinician. So this is the first part when a patient comes to us, the signs and symptoms. After the signs and symptoms, we will go to the general examination of the patient. So what we will see in the general examination? First of all, we will see the general appearance. Okay, the build, whether he is well built or moderately built, that we will see in the general examination. And after that, we will see the nourishment, whether he is well nourished or not, that we will see in the general examination. And mental status, whether he is conscious or semi-conscious or unconscious, or whether he is coherent or not, all these things we will see in the general examination. And apart from this, we will see the pulse rate, the blood pressure, respiratory rate, and temperature. All the vitals we will see in the general examination depending on the suspected disease. Apart from that, we will see the pallor, icterus, cyanosis, clubbing, lymphadenopathy, and edema. All these things we will see in the general examination. So why we are seeing all these things? We are seeing all these things for approach to the diagnosis. So depending upon the system that is affected and depending upon the disease that we suspect, we will see all these things so that we can come to a conclusion that particular system is affected or he may be affected with a particular disease. So for the approach to the diagnosis, we will see all these things. So pallor, what is pallor? So pallor is to check whether the patient is anemic or not. So here we will see the visible mucous membranes. To check the pallor, we will see the visible mucous membranes. So here you can see, here it is red in color and here it is pale. So that means the patient here is not anemic and the patient in this case is anemic because his mucous membranes are pale. So that's why we will see for the pallor to check whether the patient is anemic or not. Next we will see the icterus. The sclera in the eyes we will see to see whether the patient is having jaundice or not. That's why we'll check the icterus. So if it is yellow in color, the patient is suffering from jaundice. If it is not yellow, it is white in color, the patient is not having the jaundice. So remember, all these things we are checking only for approach to the diagnosis. Cyanosis. The bluish discoloration of the skin due to decreased oxygen supply is the cyanosis. We check whether there is cyanosis is present or not. Clubbing. So clubbing is swelling at the tips of the fingers. Lymphedema. So here you can see the lymphedema. Lymph nodes are enlarged. And edema. Edema means, you know, the accumulation of fluid. Swelling due to accumulation of fluid is known as edema. So edema, it can be unilateral, one side affecting the one side, or it can be bilateral, affecting both the legs. And edema can be pitting or non-pitting. So here you can see the pitting edema. So edema can be pitting or non-pitting. So all these changes we will see only to know the underlying cause, to know the diagnosis. So if suppose pitting and non-pitting edema, the cause can be renal or cardiovascular. Similarly, it is unilateral or bilateral. The cause can be systemic or localized cause. So to approach the diagnosis, we will see all these things. The pallor, icterus, cyanosis, clubbing, lymphadenopathy and edema. All these things we will check in the general examination for approach to the diagnosis. So after general examination, this is an example I am showing. We will come to a conclusion that the patient is moderately built, he is well nourished and mentally he is sound, he is good and his vitals are within the normal limit. And there is no pallor, no icterus, no cyanosis, no clubbing, no lymphadenopathy, no edema. So by all these things we will conclude in the general examination. Or if they are positive, we will write the pallor is positive, present. Similarly, icterus is present. In that way, we will conclude the general examination. So after general examination, after clinical features and general examination, we will go to the systemic examination and we will check the systems particularly. Okay. So respiratory system. First we will see the respiratory system, cardiovascular system, central nervous system and gastrointestinal system. And after seeing the clinical features and general examination, we will suspect some system might be affected and we will more focus on that system in the systemic examination. In cardiovascular examination, cardiovascular system, we will see the heart sounds. The normal heart sounds are present or not, or if there is any abnormality in the heart sound. And we will see the murmurs, if there are any murmurs. And we will see the carotid arterial pulse and jugular venous pulse. All these things we will see in the cardiovascular examination. And the respiratory system. In respiratory system, we will see whether the normal respiratory sounds, respiratory breath sounds are present or not. And if there is any shortness of the breath, wheezing, stridor are present, or any special respiratory sounds like rales and rhonchi are present. All these are present or absent, we will see in the respiratory examination. If they are present, we can suspect some disease related to the respiratory system. Similarly, in central nervous system, we will see the mental status of the patient and we will examine the cranial nerves, the motor and sensory examination, and we will see all the reflexes in the coordination of the patient and we will see the gait. All these things are normal or not, we will examine in the central nervous system examination in the systemic examination. If all are normal, he is not suffering from a nervous system disorder. If there is any abnormality, then we can suspect some nervous system disorder. Okay, similarly, gastrointestinal system, we will see the organomegaly, if there is any enlargement of the organs, and if there is any referred pain, and bowel sounds, whether they are normal or not, and rigidity and guarding. If there is any rigidity or guarding is present when we are palpating the abdomen, we will see in the systemic examination of gastrointestinal tract, gastrointestinal system. So in this way, we will examine different systems in the systemic examination, and we will come to a conclusion. This is the conclusion for the systemic examination. The cardiovascular, the S1, S2 sounds are normal, and no abnormal sounds, no murmurs. And respiratory system, whether the normal vesicular breath sounds are heard or not, and there are no added sounds like wheezing, stridor, bronchi, rales, no added sounds. And we will see the gastrointestinal system, it is soft, non-tender, and no organomegaly is seen. And CNS, all the reflexes, sensory and motor functions are normal. And if there is any abnormality in the systemic examination, we will add the abnormality to that particular system. If there are some abnormality in the heart sound, we will add it here. If there are murmurs, we write which type of murmur is present. If there is any defect in the breath sounds, or if there is any added sound, we add in the systemic examination of the respiratory system. Similarly, if there is any organomegaly, we will add in the gastrointestinal system examination. And CNS, whether if there is any disorder, we will add in the systemic examination of the central nervous system. And next is the, after systemic examination, we will come to the provisional diagnosis. Provisional diagnosis is nothing but the most likely diagnosis. So after provisional diagnosis, we will come to the investigations. The investigations which are related to the particular system or disease that we suspect in a patient. And after that, treatment, finally, final diagnosis. After final diagnosis, we give the treatment depending upon the severity and complications of the disease. Because after getting the results of the investigations, we will be knowing whether the disease is present or not, and what is the severity and extent of the disease, and whether the complications of the disease are started or not. So by seeing all these factors, we will give the treatment to the patient. Next is our case discussion. So the first case, case 1. So read the case carefully. A 20-year-old college student was admitted in the hospital with cough and fever. The patient complains of weakness, dizziness, and headache. For an year, he had experienced increased heart rate, shortness of breath. That means his history. And on examination, the patient appeared rather well built. So he is well built. So if you see this case, everything is important in the case. So he is 20-year-old college student. So the age of the patient is 20 years. So the case may be, the disease may be a disease which is more common in adults. And the patient admitted with cough and fever, the symptoms, and the patient complains of weakness, dizziness, and headache. So all these are generalized symptoms. So we can't come to a conclusion. And he is having history of increased heart rate and shortness of breath. So all these are about the symptoms and signs. After symptoms and signs, we will go to the general examination. So in general examination, we will see the build of the patient. Here the patient is well built. So after general examination, we will also see the mucous membranes. We will see the pallor. So here you can see the visible mucous membranes were pale. That means the patient is having anemia. So this is very important in this case. And in the systemic examination, the heart was enlarged distinctly. So after the general examination, systemic examination, we'll go for the investigations. So here the investigations, blood smear. So the blood smear showed irregular, thin, elongated, crescent-shaped red cells. So this is important. So if you see the blood smear, so blood smear is a blood investigation in which we can detailedly study the cells, blood cells. So here you can see the blood picture. In this case, so here you can see the elongated cells which are crescent shape. So that is about the blood smear in the investigation. Then after that, gel electrophoresis. The pattern, the gel electrophoresis, the pattern of hemoglobin from normal person and affected person is depicted below. So in gel electrophoresis, there is difference between the hemoglobin of the normal person and the affected person in this case. So the hemoglobin in normal person is HbA and the hemoglobin in this person is HbS. So if you see the gel electrophoresis, so here the electrophoresis, this is the electrophoresis. In this, on the slide, we will put different samples. So when the current is passed through this, the samples will move. Okay, the blood samples will be moving depending upon the type of hemoglobin present in the sample. So that is gel electrophoresis. A gel is present here on the slides. So on the slide which contains gel, the samples are poured. So when the current is passed through this slide, the sample will be moving depending upon the hemoglobin present in the sample. So this is the case, and the questions about this case are: what is the probable diagnosis? What is the cause of this disease? And what is the difference between normal and sickled hemoglobin? How is the mobility of hemoglobin in electrophoresis? So these are the questions about this case 1. So what is the probable diagnosis? So what we had seen in the case, we had seen the signs and symptoms. So all the symptoms are generalized symptoms. So we can't come to a conclusion by seeing the symptoms. The cough, fever, weakness, dizziness, headache, all these are generalized symptoms. So after that, in general examination, the patient is well built, and in general examination, the visible membranes are pale. That means patient is suffering from anemia. This is very important for us for diagnosis. And after that, we had sent the patient for investigations. In the investigations, we had seen in the blood smear, in the blood examination, in blood smear, we had seen the elongated crescent-shaped cells. This is also important for us for diagnosis. And apart from that, we had seen the electrophoresis, gel electrophoresis pattern. In this, the patient is having the HbS type of hemoglobin in gel electrophoresis, unlike the normal hemoglobin HbA. So these points are important for us for diagnosis. The anemia, the pale, the visual mucous membrane pale, so he is anemic, and the blood smear he is having elongated crescent-shaped cells, and in gel electrophoresis he is having the HbS abnormal hemoglobin. So by all these, we can conclude that the patient is suffering from sickle cell anemia. So this is the probable diagnosis. So this is the answer for your first question. The probable diagnosis, sickle cell anemia. So this is a patient of sickle cell anemia. Here you can see the patient is weak and his mucous membranes are pale. And coming to the second question, what is the cause of this disease? So what is the cause of this disease? It is due to presence of inherited abnormal hemoglobin HbS that we had seen in the gel electrophoresis. The normal hemoglobin is HbA, and here in this patient, the sickle cell anemia is due to presence of abnormal hemoglobin, the inherited abnormal hemoglobin HbS. So what is the abnormality? So the abnormality in the hemoglobin here is abnormal beta chain. So you know the hemoglobin is made up of 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. So these are nothing but the proteins. Each chain is a protein which is synthesized from transcription and translation. So if there is any defect in the gene, in the DNA, there will be defect in the mRNA that is formed, and this mRNA, when it forms the different polypeptide chains, there will be defect in the polypeptide chain. In this condition, in this particular disease, the sickle cell anemia, the defect in the mRNA leads to defective formation of beta chain in the hemoglobin. So when there is defect of the beta chain, finally the whole hemoglobin molecule will be abnormal. Okay, this leads to sickle cell anemia. And why this abnormal beta chain? The abnormal beta chain of hemoglobin is caused due to mutation of the gene that is responsible for the formation of the polypeptide chain. And we know the abnormal hemoglobin causes distortion, the sickling of the red blood cells. So if you see this in detail, so we know the DNA, from DNA we'll be having different nucleotides. So each nucleotide, from these nucleotides we'll get the mRNA. Okay. If there is mutation in the DNA, then there will be change in the nucleotide. If there is change in the nucleotide of DNA, it leads to change in the nucleotide in the mRNA that is formed. When there is change in the nucleotide in the mRNA, then there will be change in the amino acid that is formed in the polypeptide synthesis. Okay. Because we know each codon, 3 nucleotides will form a codon, and each codon will code for a amino acid. If there is any change in single nucleotide, then the whole codon will be changed, and the codon coding for the amino acid will be changed. So due to this, the amino acid sequence in the polypeptide will change, and abnormal polypeptides are formed. That is occurring in the case of sickle cell anemia in beta chain. So this occurs in the mutation. Here you can see the 3 nucleotides will form a codon, and each codon will code for a amino acid. So when there is any defect, whether it is insertion or deletion or transversion of a single nucleotide, then what happens is the codon will be changed. Then the amino acid that is formed will be changed. The amino acid that is attached will be changed. So finally the polypeptide chain formed will be defective. So here you can see ACA, AAG are the codons, individual codon. If suppose the G is introduced in between, then instead of AAG, AGA is formed. So actually AAG codes for lysine, but AGA codes for glutamate. So the newly formed, the defective polypeptide chain contains glutamate in case of lysine. Similarly, if some nucleotide is deleted, then also same thing happens. So in case of sickle cell anemia, you can see GAG codes for glutamate that is present in the normal hemoglobin, but due to mutation, what happens is this A adenosine is replaced by T. Okay, thymine. Then what happens is instead of glutamate, the valine is formed. So here the basic defect is glutamase is replaced by valine in the 6th position in the polypeptide chain of beta chain of hemoglobin. So next, coming to the third question, what is the difference between normal and sickle hemoglobin that we had seen? So this is the polypeptide chain, that is the beta chain of the hemoglobin, in which different amino acids are placed. So here you can see in the 6th position, glutamate or glutamic acid is present in the normal hemoglobin, whereas in the sickle cell, the hemoglobin contains valine at the 6th position in the beta chain in sickle cell anemia. Okay, so the glutamate in 6th position of beta chain of normal hemoglobin HbA is replaced by valine, which leads to HbS in sickle cell anemia. Then the next question, how is the mobility of hemoglobin in the electrophoresis? So the sickle hemoglobin, HbS, moves slowly compared to normal hemoglobin, HbA. So in the question, in the case we had seen the gel electrophoresis. So depending upon the gel electrophoresis only, we came to the diagnosis of sickle cell anemia. So how we came to diagnosis? The sickle hemoglobin moves slowly when compared to the normal hemoglobin. So this we can see in the gel electrophoresis, by which we can conclude, we can come to the conclusion that the diagnosis is sickle cell anemia. So in electrophoresis, hemoglobin electrophoresis, different samples are poured in here, and the electric current is passed, and there will be movement of the samples depending upon the hemoglobin present in the sample. So here you can see the movement. So this is the sample, normal sample with normal hemoglobin. Here you can see it is moving to a longer distance, and here it is moving up to a particular distance. So this is the sample which may be contain both normal hemoglobin and sickle hemoglobin. And this is the third case. Here you can see the sample is moving only up to a particular distance. So that's why we can suspect some HbS, abnormal hemoglobin present in that sample. And we can come to the diagnosis as sickle cell anemia. That is for diagnosis. So in this slide here you can see here a control is passed initially which contains HbS, HbF and HbA. All types of hemoglobin is present. Here the patient sample is poured on the other side, on the slide, in the gel electrophoresis. We are seeing about the gel electrophoresis. So if we pour the patient sample here, then it is moving up to this level. So here you can see the thick band. That means more hemoglobin is present of this type. So this is relevant to the sickle cell hemoglobin, the abnormal hemoglobin. That means the patient is suffering from, by this we can conclude the patient is suffering from sickle cell anemia. And finally, coming to complications, sickle cell anemia, they will form sickling, it leads to sickling of the cells, and they will block at the junction of the blood vessels, and this leads to blockage of blood supply to different organs, which finally leads to number of complications. Okay, so this is about the sickle cell anemia case. So we had come to diagnosis by seeing the symptoms and by seeing the general examination, the pallor, due to which we came to know that the patient is anemic, and in the systemic examination, the heart is enlarged. See here, why heart is enlarged means in sickle cell anemia patient, the oxygen supply is less due to decreased blood supply. The oxygen supply to the cells is less, and to compensate that, there will be hypertrophy. So that's why there will be heart will be increased. Heart will be large, distinctly large. And by systemic examination, we came to the heart is large, and by the investigations, we came to know that the blood smear will be having long crescent cells. That is important for diagnosis. And also in gel electrophoresis, electrophoresis is meant for separating different proteins. See, hemoglobin is also a protein. So here we are separating different types of hemoglobin for getting the diagnosis. So in gel electrophoresis, we'll pour the normal sample and also the patient sample. So the patient sample is moving only up to a particular level. That means we can suspect the abnormal hemoglobin is present in the patient sample. So HbS is present in the patient sample. So that's why we came to the diagnosis that the patient is suffering from the sickle cell anemia. And why sickle cell anemia? We had known the reason. Due to mutation in the gene, there will be change in the nucleotide. So that change is carried to the mRNA. Change in the nucleotides in the mRNA. So that change is carried to the newly formed protein, that is newly formed polypeptide chain, that is newly formed beta chain of the hemoglobin. So when the defect from the DNA due to mutation is carried to the mRNA, is carried to the polypeptide chain, is carried to the beta chain of the hemoglobin, and finally it is carried to the completely formed hemoglobin. So defective hemoglobin is formed. So that leads to sickle cell anemia. Okay. And coming to the treatment of sickle cell anemia, there are two types of sickle cell anemia. You have to check whether it is heterozygous sickle cell anemia or homozygous. Heterozygous means the mutation, he will get the mutated gene, the mutant gene only from a single parent. That is known as heterozygous sickle cell anemia, or it is known as sickle cell trait. So in sickle cell trait, there won't be much symptoms and signs. The patient will lead a normal life. So there is no need of particular treatment, and the patient will give the counseling to the patient because he can act as carrier to the next generations. So we will give the counseling and after effect of the heterozygous sickle cell anemia or sickle cell trait. If the patient is homozygous, that is, he will be having two mutant genes. He will get the mutant genes from both the parents. So that patient, there will be very severe effects. There will be sickling of the cells. There will be more amount of HbS in that patient instead of HbA, and he will get all the complications. So the main line of treatment is blood transfusion. There is no particular treatment because the cells will be keep on sickling. So repeatedly we will do the test for every 6 months. We'll measure the blood. We will see the blood smear and we will see the hemoglobin levels periodically, and we will give the blood transfusions. Regular blood transfusions are given in these patients. That is the treatment. Coming to the second case, case 2. A 36-year-old man was admitted to the hospital following episodes of nausea, vomiting, and generalized weakness. Upon examination, his liver was enlarged and tender. So here, the first thing is clinical features. You can see here the nausea, vomiting, and generalized weakness. Only these are given. And coming to the general examination, nothing is given about the build and appearance of the patient, and nothing is given about the anemia and jaundice and all those things. And in systemic examination, they had given that liver was enlarged and tender. Okay, liver was enlarged and tender. This is seen in the examination. And after that, coming to investigations, the laboratory findings are as follows. The LFTs are abnormal. The ALT, the alanine transaminase or SGPT is 1500 international units per liter. That is very high. The normal being the 4 to 40 international units per liter. And AST, aspartate transaminase or SGOT, it is 400 international units per liter. The normal being the 4 to 44 international units per liter. So this is also very high. Okay. And the plasma total bilirubin is 9 milligram per deciliter. The normal is some 0.2 to 1.2 milligram per deciliter. So this is also a little bit high in this patient. So these are the laboratory investigations. So what is our diagnosis? So here you can see the ALT is increased very much. So coming to the questions, what is the provisional diagnosis? What further tests do you suggest? What are the types of jaundice? And what is Vandenberg reaction? What is its importance? So these are the questions. So what is your provisional diagnosis? So in this case, we can't come to a final diagnosis because the information is very less. That's why we'll be coming to the provisional diagnosis. The investigations are also not completed, only limited investigations are done. So we can't come to a final diagnosis because of the limited information about the examination and limited information about the investigation. So what is the provisional diagnosis? So here the symptoms are also very generalized symptoms, so we can't come to a conclusion. But in examination, we had seen the liver. The liver is enlarged and tender. So the disease is somewhat related to liver. And apart from that, here it is bilirubin. The total bilirubin is 9 milligram per deciliter. That means the patient might be having icterus. but here it is not given, the information is not given in the case that, but the patient might be having icterus due to increased bilirubin levels. And coming to the enzymes, liver enzymes, here the ALT is very much increased. And we know in ALT and AST, the ALT is more specific. It is more specific to the liver, ALT. So ALT is more increased. So that's why we can suspect some liver disease. It is jaundice. It is related to liver disease. Increased bilirubin means it is jaundice. It is more related to liver. It is more specific to liver. So that's why our provisional diagnosis, we can come to provisional diagnosis as hepatic jaundice. Okay, because bilirubin levels are increased and SGOT, SGPT are increased, and ALT is more increased, by which we can suspect it is hepatic jaundice. We can't confirm it because the investigations are not sufficient. Still, there are confirmatory investigations. So by doing all those only, we can come to a conclusion. And our general examination information is also not sufficient. He had not given any icterus and specific aspects in the general examination. So that's why our provisional diagnosis, hepatic jaundice. And what is jaundice? We know yellowish pigmentation of skin, sclera and mucosa due to increased plasma bilirubin is jaundice. It is known as also hyperbilirubinemia. Okay, here we know that the bilirubin levels are increased because in investigations we had seen it is 9 milligram per deciliter. So coming to basics, we know the unconjugated bilirubin is liberated due to hemolysis, normal physiological hemolysis, and this unconjugated bilirubin binds with the albumin and it reaches the liver where it gets conjugated by the glucuronides, and this conjugated bilirubin will goes to the small intestine through biliary tract, and from there it will be excreted as stercobilin and urobilin through urine and feces. That is a normal mechanism. So in abnormal thing, what happens is there are 3 types of jaundice. When there is defect in the hemolysis, it is prehepatic or hemolytic jaundice. When the defect is within the liver, it is hepatic jaundice, and the defect is after the conjugation, this post conjugation, it is known as post hepatic or obstructive jaundice. So this is the case of hepatic jaundice, that the defect is in the liver. Okay. So what happens in hepatic jaundice? The formation of bilirubin is normal, but due to the defect in the liver can't manage all the unconjugated bilirubin. It can't conjugate all the unconjugated bilirubin. So the unconjugated bilirubin levels will be increased in the blood. And apart from that, as there is liver damage, a part of the unconjugated will be conjugated. But as there is liver damage, there is inflammation and edema of the liver cells. Due to this edema, there is an element of blockage to the conjugated bilirubin to pass to the intestine. So that's why conjugated bilirubin also increases in the hepatic jaundice. Both are increased. The unconjugated bilirubin is increased because all the unconjugated bilirubin formed can't be managed by the liver cells due to damage in the liver cells. So the unconjugated bilirubin will be increased and it is accumulated and released into the bloodstream. Coming to the conjugated bilirubin, some part of the bilirubin is conjugated, but it can't be completely passed to the small intestine due to edema of the hepatic cells. Due to this, the conjugated bilirubin is also accumulated and it is released into the bloodstream. So in this way, both conjugated and unconjugated are increased in the hepatic jaundice. So this is the basic defect in the hepatic jaundice is defect in the conjugation, unconjugated conversion of unconjugated bilirubin to the conjugated bilirubin. That is bilirubin diglucuronides. This occurs in the hepatic cell. In the liver, this is as there is damage to the hepatic cell, this step can't take place. That is a basic defect in the hepatic jaundice. So that is our provisional diagnosis. So next is, what further tests do you suggest? So to confirm our diagnosis, what are the further tests that we have to do in this case? Serum direct bilirubin, estimation of urine bile salts, bile pigments, and urobilinogen. So for complete evaluation of jaundice, we have to do the serum direct bilirubin also, and apart from that, we have to estimate the urine bile salts, urine bile pigments, and urobilinogen. So why serum direct bilirubin? So in the case we had seen, only the total bilirubin is given. So total bilirubin can be increased in hemolytic jaundice, hepatic jaundice, and also obstructive jaundice. So that's why we need the further information, that is the direct bilirubin. So if we get the direct bilirubin, we can be knowing the indirect bilirubin also. Okay. So if we know the direct bilirubin, we can tell whether it is hepatic, hemolytic, or obstructive. Okay, because we know in hemolytic only the indirect bilirubin will be increased. In case of hepatic jaundice, both indirect and direct bilirubin will be increased. And in case of obstructive, only the direct bilirubin will be increased. So here the estimation of direct bilirubin is very much needed to know the increased levels of direct and indirect bilirubin. So that's why in the case the information is not given to us, we are suggesting the patient to go for the direct bilirubin also. So in this case, if we get the increase of both direct and indirect, we can confirm our provisional diagnosis, the hepatic jaundice. And similarly, the urine bile salts, bile pigments, urobilinogen are also necessary to differentiate different types of jaundice. See here you can see in hepatic jaundice, the urobilinogen is almost normal and the bile salts and bile pigments are present in the urine. So if we send this patient to the urine examination also, if bile salts are normal, urobilinogen is normal and bile salts and bile pigments are present, then we can confirm the diagnosis as hepatic jaundice. Okay. These bile salts are present due to defect in the intrahepatic circulation. So you know how these tests are examined. The bile salts by sulfur test. You know how to perform the sulfur test. And bile pigments by Fauchett's test. You will observe light green color on the tissue paper. Here the sulfur powder will be sinking in Hayes test. And here there will be formation of green color in the Fauchett's test. And the Ehrlich's test, there will be purple color for assessing the urobilinogen. So in this way, we will suggest the direct bilirubin, the estimation of direct bilirubin in the serum, and the estimation of to see the absence or presence of bile salts, bile pigments, and urobilinogen in the urine for confirming our provisional diagnosis, the hepatic jaundice. And the next question is, what are the types of jaundice that we had already seen? Hemolytic, hepatic, and obstructive. There are three types of jaundice. The hemolytic jaundice, it is due to increased hemolysis of RBC. This is also known as pre-hepatic jaundice because it occurs before the bilirubin enters the liver. Hepatic jaundice or hepatocellular jaundice, it is due to impaired conjugation. This is hepatic jaundice. This is hepatic because this occurs when the bilirubin enters the liver. But the defect is in the conjugation. Only some part of bilirubin is conjugated. And that part is also not sent to the intestines properly. So indirect and direct both are included in the hepatic jaundice. And the next one is obstructive jaundice. This is due to obstruction in bile duct. This is also known as post-hepatic jaundice because this occurs due to obstruction in the, after the bilirubin gets conjugated in the liver. Okay. So hemolytic, hepatic, and obstructive. These are the types of jaundice. And the next question is, what is Van der Berg reaction and what is its importance? So Van der Berg test, it is a test to see the bilirubin. direct and indirect bilirubins. Okay. Here the reagent used is diazo reagent. And there are two types, direct and indirect. See, in any test, there will be positive or negative, but there is a specialty in the Vandenberg test. There is direct positive and also indirect positive. There are two positives in case of Vandenberg test. Okay, remember the reagent. Here the reagent used is diazo reagent, but the positive is direct and indirect. So suppose if this is the sample, if the reagent diazo reagent is added, if there is color change, purple color is formed, then that is known as direct positive. It indicates the presence of conjugated bilirubin. How much it is present, we will check it by photometric methods, by calorimetric method, by measuring the intensity of the color. We will check how much conjugated bilirubin is present. Okay, but the direct positive indicates the presence of conjugated bilirubin. And coming to the second case, indirect positive. If we add the reagent, then there is no color change. Then when we add the alcohol in that, then the purple color is formed. It indicates indirect positive. It is not directly positive, it is indirect positive, and it indicates the presence of unconjugated bilirubin. So how much is present? It is calorimetrically measured, but indirect positive indicates unconjugated bilirubin. So here what is happening is, in case of conjugated bilirubin, we know conjugated bilirubin is more soluble in water. So that's why when the reagent is added, it will easily combine with the reagent, it will react with the reagent and gives the color. So that's why directly we will get the positive. But unconjugated bilirubin is less soluble. So it won't be soluble with the diazo reagent and it won't form the color. When we add the alcohol, it will become soluble and it will combine with the diazo reagent and it will give the positive test, that is purple color. So that's why direct positive and indirect positive. Direct positive indicates conjugated bilirubin and indirect positive indicates unconjugated bilirubin. And how much amount is present is measured calorimetrically. So this is the Vandenberg test. Vandenberg test is special that it is having two positives, direct positive and indirect positive. It is used to check the direct bilirubin and indirect bilirubin. The reagent used here is diazo reagent. So Vandenberg reaction is used to detect the increased bilirubin, that is direct and indirect bilirubin in serum due to formation of azobilirubin. So the principle here is the bilirubin combines with the diazo reagent to form azobilirubin. That is the principle. So it is of two types, direct and indirect. So the direct Vandenberg reaction indicates the conjugated bilirubin. It gives purple color direct. Indirect Vandenberg reaction indicates unconjugated bilirubin. So it gives purple color only with the addition of alcohol. And we know why here we are getting direct positive, because the conjugated bilirubin is very soluble. It directly reacts with the diazo reagent and directly gives the purple color. Whereas in unconjugated bilirubin is not soluble in water. That's why it will react with the diazo reagent only after adding the alcohol. Then only it will give the purple color. So that's why direct test indicates conjugated bilirubin. Indirect test indicates unconjugated bilirubin. And the principle of this test is any direct or indirect bilirubin or conjugated or unconjugated bilirubin, they will react with the diazo reagent to form a azobilirubin complex. That azobilirubin is the purple in color. That's why we are getting purple. So here we finish the case 2. Case 2 is nothing but it is hepatic jaundice. There is no much information in the case. Only with the limited information we had gone to the provisional diagnosis. We had seen the symptoms, to the generalized symptoms, and we had seen in the general examination, systemic examination, we see the enlargement of the liver and tenderness of the liver. So we had suspected some liver disease, and coming to investigations, we had seen the increased bilirubin and increased SGOT and SGPT, that is AST and ALT. to very high extent. And in that ALT and AST, ALT is more increased. So that's why we had suspected some liver disease. So as bilirubin is increased and we had suspected liver disease, so provisional diagnosis is hepatic jaundice. And in hepatic jaundice, we know there is increase of both direct and indirect bilirubin. Then only we can confirm it as hepatic jaundice. So that's why we had suggesting the patient to go for the further investigations, the direct bilirubin, indirect bilirubin. By Vandenberg reaction, due to that test, we had sent the patient to check his direct and indirect bilirubin levels. If both are increased, then only we can confirm our provisional diagnosis, the hepatic jaundice. Similarly, we had sent the patient for the urine examination also to check the bile salts, bile pigments, and urobilinogen. If the bile salts and bile pigments are present and urobilinogen is absent, then only we can confirm our diagnosis as hepatic jaundice. And we had seen about the Vandenberg reaction, the direct and indirect, the positive, the conjugated and the unconjugated bilirubins, which are measured colorimetrically. Okay, that is about the second case. And coming to the treatment of the hepatic jaundice, we will see the underlying cause. We have to treat the cause due to which the liver cells got damaged. Okay, so what is the underlying cause? For the underlying cause, we will do all the liver function tests and we will send for the ultrasound, the radiological examination, and we will detect the underlying cause. So after treating the underlying cause only, the bilirubin levels will get to the normal range. Okay, that is about the case 2. Coming to the case 3. So read the case carefully. A 38 years lady came with sweating, weight loss, heat intolerance, fatigue, menstrual irregularities. She had tachycardia, warm and moist skin, tremors. She had abnormal protrusion of iris, that is exophthalmos. So if you see the case carefully, the age of the patient is 38 years. That means the disease may be a disease which will be occurring in the middle-aged females, mostly because it is a 38 years female. And came with the following symptoms. You can see all these symptoms, and you can see the tachycardia, warm and moist skin, tremors. And apart from that, you can see the abnormal protrusion of iris, that is known as exophthalmos. Only that thing is given, only the signs and symptoms, only the clinical features are being given in the case. So very limited information. No general examination, no systemic examination, no investigation, nothing, sir, nothing is given. So the questions are, what is your provisional diagnosis? What investigations help you in your diagnosis? What are their normal values? And what is ideal? So no information, no much information is given in this case. Only the clinical features are given. No generalized investigation results or no specific investigations. Like in first case, the general information, the blood smear is taken, and the specific information is also given in the gel as gel electrophoresis. So here no information. In second case, in hepatic jaundice, at least some investigations are given, at least some information is given. But in this case, no information is given about the investigation. So now we have to see what is the provisional diagnosis. So what is the provisional diagnosis? By seeing the signs and symptoms, all the symptoms, by seeing the symptoms, different symptoms, we can know that the metabolic rate is increased. All the tachycardia, the tremors, the sweating, all these means the metabolic rate is increased. So in which conditions the metabolic rate is increased? And moreover, a middle-aged patient, and moreover females. So what is a disease which is common in the middle-aged people, which is common in females, and in which the metabolic rate is increased? The disease is hyperthyroidism. So we know the T3, T4 production is increased. So due to this, the metabolic rate is increased. And due to this, there will be sweating, tachycardia, tremors, heat and cold intolerance. All these, the patient will be getting. Okay. and this is more common in the middle-aged females. So that's why our provisional diagnosis is hyperthyroidism. And this the signs and symptoms of hyperthyroidism we had already seen in the previous sessions: the heat intolerance, tachycardia, irritability, menstrual irregularities, the tremors, the anxiety and sleep disturbances, fatigue, weakness. All these are present in hyperthyroidism due to increased metabolic rate, which occurs due to increased production of T3 and T4. So this is a exophthalmos, the protrusion of the eyeballs. And what investigations help you in your diagnosis? So in the case the investigations are not given to us, so we have to suggest the investigation. What investigations help you in confirming the diagnosis? It is obviously, as this is a thyroid disorders, we'll go for the thyroid profile. So what are the common parameters present in thyroid profile? T3, triiodothyronine. T4, tetraiodothyronine, or also known as thyroxine. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. FT3, free T3. FT4, it is free T4. This FT3, FT4, that is free T3 and free T4 are nothing but it is a part of T3 and T4 which are not bound to any proteins. The unbound or free fraction of T3 and T4 are known as FT3 and FT4. So coming to the formation, we know the formation. There are different steps for the formation of thyroid hormones T3 and T4. The uptake, that is uptake of iodine, and the oxidation from oxidation of iodide to iodine, organification and coupling. Okay, uptake means uptake of iodine, and oxidation means oxidation of iodide which is present in blood to the iodine. And next organification, that is the addition of iodine and tyrosine, and coupling. Coupling means the monoiodotyrosine and diiodotyrosine will combine to form T3 and T4. This is the coupling. So these are the different steps in the formation of T3 and T4. So what is the normal ranges? What are the normal ranges T3 and T4 that you have to remember? T3 is 80 to 180 nanograms per deciliter, and T4 it is 4 to 12 micrograms per deciliter, and TSH it is 0.5 to 5.5 microunits per ml. Apart from that, the free fraction of T3, FT3 is 1.7 to 4.2 nanograms per deciliter, and the free fraction of T4, that is FT4, is 0.8 to 1.8 micrograms per deciliter. And here you can see the interpretation depending upon the levels of T3 and T4. This is normal. If TSH, T3 and T4 are normal, we can conclude it as normal. In hyperthyroidism, the TSH is low and T3 is more. The T3 and T4 production is more, and due to feedback control, the TSH will be low. In hypothyroidism, in primary hypothyroidism, the T3, T4 will be low, and due to this, the TSH will be high. And in special case, the secondary hypothyroidism, T4 and TSH both can be low. Okay, this is the interpretation of the thyroid hormones. If suppose the T3 and T4 are at the borderline, then we will send the patient for the FT3 and FT4 for confirmation of the increased or decreased thyroid hormones. And what is iodine trap? The ability of the thyroid gland to accumulate iodide against concentration gradient is trap. That is iodine trap. So iodine trap, here you can see the sodium which is present inside the cell will go to the bloodstream for exchange of potassium ions, and this sodium along with the iodide enters the cell. And here the iodide is converted to iodine. See, iodine is present all over the body, and tyrosine is also present in all over the body. Then why only these thyroid hormones are synthesized in the thyroid gland? Why not in other parts of the body? Because the iodine which is present in the bloodstream is present in the form of iodide. This iodide can't combine with the tyrosine. The conversion of iodide to iodine occurs only in the thyroid gland, in the follicles of the thyroid gland. Because in the follicles of thyroid gland only the enzyme is present, thyroperoxidase. So this thyroperoxidase converts iodide to iodine. So this iodine combines with the tyrosine to form monoiodothyronine and diiodothyronine. This monoiodothyronine and diiodothyronine combines with the coupling occurs for the formation of T3 and T4. Okay. So this is the formation you can see here. Different steps in the formation. And next, so here we had finished the third case. It is hyperthyroidism. So here there is no information, only clinical signs and symptoms are given. So that's why we have to complete provisional diagnosis. So we had seen the age is middle age, and the patient is female patient, and the signs and symptoms we had seen. All the signs and symptoms are due to increase in metabolic rate. So the information that we got from the case is middle age, female, and the metabolic rate is increased. So all this happens in increased T3, T4 production. That's why we came to a provisional diagnosis that this is hyperthyroidism. So to confirm our diagnosis, we have to send the patient for the investigation. That's why we had suggested thyroid profile, which includes T3, T4, TSH, and FT3 and FT4 can also be done. So if T3 and T4 are increased and TSH is decreased, then only we can confirm our diagnosis hyperthyroidism. Okay. And we had seen the normal ranges of the thyroid hormones, and we had seen the iodine trap. Iodine trap is nothing but the taking of iodine, the ability of the thyroid gland for taking the iodine. Okay. When iodide is taken and it is converted to iodine, then only T3, T4 are formed. And we know the feedback control when T3, T4 are increased, it controls by feedback control TRH and TSH. We know TRH is produced from hypothalamus, which stimulates the anterior pituitary to release the TSH, and this TSH will stimulate the thyroid gland for the release of T3 and T4. That is feedback control that we had seen in the previous sessions. And for this formation, there are 4 steps for formation of T3 and T4. The first step is the uptake of the iodine, in which the iodine is taken by the thyroid gland. We know thyroid gland contains thyroid follicles. The follicles contains thyroglobin inside and the follicular cells. So the thyroglobin contains tyrosine. So this uptake of iodine, this iodine goes to the follicle, and within the follicle, in the thyroglobin, this iodide is converted to iodine by thyroperoxidase. So the first step is uptake. The second step is oxidation. This occurs in the colloid, in the follicles. And the third step is organification. That is this converted iodide combined with the tyrosine to form MIT and DIT, the monoiodothyronine diiodothyronine. And this MIT and DIT combines, that is coupling occurs for the formation of T3 and T4. So this is about the case 3. And these are my references for today's cases. And these are some helpful websites about these cases. And thank you. So thank you all.